Good morning, everyone, and welcome to April Risk Reduction, where we're going to risk management, where we are going to discuss some fairly common issues. I keep a log of the questions I get. I keep notes, and I also then go through my notes and kind of chart what are the things the agents are struggling with the most. Sometimes they're pretty serious, and sometimes they're not so serious, but they're common. And so, time to time, I do classes. I've done one a month ago, and this is a continuation of that. This is addressing questions I get all the time. Some of the issues can be pretty serious, like I said, and some of them just a pain in the neck if you don't quite understand maybe a few things about how to deal with the various issues. So enough rambling. Let's jump right into the presentation. Let me share my screen. I think this is it. All right, let me go to. All right, everyone can see my screen, hopefully.
Yeah, well, you can X out that little thing in the corner, the spyware.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, close that.
I get all kinds of junk coming up on my computer. I need a technician to come in and clean up my computer for me.
There you go.
All right, let's get started then on today's class. And of course, always start with this. Going to go through it real quickly. Just again, how to reach me, business hours, use the direct line. It's the quickest. The cell phone, I don't look at it as often. I keep my email open the entire time, but the only time I'm not looking at email is like right now with in the middle of a presentation, but it's minimized even now. So, email is also very, very quick, and I look at that even on weekends as well. Evenings and weekends, do call my cell. I recommend you text because I keep the ringer off, but I see the text pretty quickly, and we'll get back to you as quickly as I can and call you back. So, all right, common issues that can cause you problems and potentially cost you money. One of these issues is, so simple, but more than a few agents have had to write a check to satisfy their client because the issue came up. So I'll address that specific one in a couple of minutes. So let's talk about, I've got 5 of them. I'm hoping I can get through them in an hour. It's gonna be a challenge. I thought that since most of these issues are reviews of things I've covered in the past, I could zoom through it pretty quickly. But as usual, I tend to add more to it and possibly lengthen the class more than I meant to. So let's see if I can't get through it. So the first issue, and it is a continuing issue, there's not a week that doesn't go by that we don't have an issue with the FHDS. And as I always say, and I say it to the other agent in your transaction, which I'll say now, I may say again, anytime you're having a problem with the other agent because you're following the guidelines I'm giving you, and the other agent is saying that you're wrong, and guess what they're indirectly saying is that I'm wrong. I don't believe I am. I check this out with CAR constantly. I watch this constantly. But the reason that it's so confusing is, number one, the form, the FHDS itself is confusing. And number two, a lot of authority figures are putting out a lot of false information. And that's sort of hard sometimes for people to accept. But I can almost prove it here, and I'll tell you my proof here toward the end of this section on why the information that I'm going to share with you, and then you share with not only your client, but the other side when you're doing an FHDS is correct. All right, so let's review that real quickly. Now, the first thing that I want to point out again is January 1st of 24, the NHD statement was modified to more clearly identify the different types of fire hazard severity zones. So AB 1280 dictated to the NHD. So everybody's doing it. It doesn't matter which NHD you're using. What I'm going to show you is now common to all reports, which is going to make it easier for you to, number one, identify whether you're the buyer or the seller, whether it's in a high or very high fire hazard zone, and if it is in a high or very high, you'll also now be aware that you need to use the FHDS. There's specifically 3 zones on the NHD statement: the high fire hazard zone in a state responsibility area, a very high in a state responsibility area, and a very high in a local responsibility area. All 3 of those necessitate the use of an FHDS. So if it's in any of those zones, and it's going to be so simple, if some of you are still struggling with it, you're going to find it a lot easier now. Here is now a more current, code compliant natural hazard disclosure statement. And the statement, of course, contains the 6 hazard zones, or the 6 zones that by law must be identified and reported to all buyers. And that's, that law years and years ago created an industry. It created the natural hazard disclosure companies that do this kind of thing. And so the one that we're concerned about in this class is the high and very high fire hazard zone. Now, this used to be, whether it was in a high or not, was buried in the report. Very high was always at the front. High was buried in the report. State law now says it needs to be up front. The state law dictates exactly what you're looking at. So in this particular case, it's no. So it's not in any of these areas. It's not. So your FHDS is not required. Now, it could say yes, and it could have any one of these checked. So, so if any one of these are checked, then you would need to do an FHDS. You must provide it unless you're exempt, of course, from a TDS. The FHDS is part of 1102 and is required if a TDS is required. And there's a couple of other things that also apply. Okay, so let's look at the fire hazard, or fire hardening and defensible space disclosure addendum, the so-called it is the FHDS. All right, now, when you print that out, you get, that's a 2-page form, the FHDS. You also get a DSDT, defensible space decision tree. I like to sort of take a little pride in the statement I'm about to make. The reason they made this is because a lot of companies don't have Walt Klein. So, people couldn't figure out how to fill out the FHDS. And so the attorneys at Carr created this decision tree. You just go through and you answer the questions, and it ultimately tells you whether or not you need to do an FHDS. This is the most confusing form I think I've ever seen Carr put out. And most recently, with a smile, Carr is acknowledging that. But absent any other source of information, they believe this is better than nothing. So, a short point I want to make here is throw this away. It's not legally required. It's not anything you're going to need. You're going to be able to tell your clients based on this class. And if you forget, call me again. And if your client has questions, they can call me. And likewise, if the other side is giving me a hard time, they can call me too. Very user-friendly. Sometimes I'm pretty blunt and direct with our own agents, but I'm conscious that if I step on your client or your co-op agent's toes, it's going to make your transactions more difficult. So throw the last 2 pages of the FHDS away and just pay attention to the first page. All right, paragraph 1 talks about the law applicability. And a fire hardening disclosure is required if it's a residential property, 1 to 4 units. The seller is required to do a TDS. The property is located in a high or very high zone, and it was constructed before January 1st of 2010. So what does that mean? What that means is on the form, the fire hardening portion of the form does not need to be filled out for properties built on January 1st or later. So not the form isn't not needed, just that particular paragraph, which is paragraph 2. We'll see it in a minute. They do not need to fill out paragraph 2 if you're selling a house built January 1 or later. All right, now that you have to meet all four of these conditions to be required. It's not any one condition, it's all four. Defensible space compliance, same sort of thing. It's required for residential properties, 1 to 4 units. The seller has to do a TDS, and the property is located in a high and very high hazard zone. Notice there's not uh, a, a, a requirement or a statement about when the property was built. The property could be built yesterday. And if it's in a high, very high fire zone, a TDS is required. It's 1 to 4 units. It's residential. You have to do the defensible space portion of the FHDS, which is paragraph 3. Hope that's not too confusing. And then, finally, the thing that I skipped over very quickly is, well, maybe I didn't even decide to highlight it, that you can now find out what zone you're in by checking the natural hazard report. Okay, so paragraph 2 is the fire hardening portion. A is a legally required notice. So that's on the form. And then these are the questions that a seller answers if their property was built before January 1st of 2010. It's a seller awareness question. Are you aware? It's not a statement of actual fact. Does it have vent openings greater than 1/8 of an inch? The seller's probably not going to know that. And if you don't know if it doesn't, then you're not aware that it does. Now, here's what they can't do. They can't not answer this question. You cannot not know what you're aware of. Gee, I don't know if I don't know if I'm aware of the fact that I have a roof covering made of wood shingles. Yeah, you've got to be aware of whether or not you are aware. I hope that's not too confusing. I think the simple thing is you cannot know what you're not aware of or not aware of. So if they can't answer this because they're telling you I don't know, it's probably no, because you're probably not aware. So that hopefully that helps. Every once in a while we still get sellers, and we sometimes get from the other side, this is not filled out. And so when the agent calls the other agent, the other says, well, my seller doesn't know. So that's a non-starter. All right. Now, defensible space paragraph 3, that's the difficult one. That's the one that's kind of confusing. So the property is in a locality where there's a vegetation management ordinance in effect. And that's true throughout San Diego County. So this is going to be checked is in San Diego County. It's going to be checked is, I believe, in all of LA County. It's going to be, there's very few counties now that don't have vegetation management ordinances. And those vegetation management ordinances basically just say how you have to maintain the vegetation around your property. Cut down the weeds, don't have flammable materials up against the house, don't have dead trees, and don't have trees close to the house that have branches overhanging the roof. That's all in a vegetation management ordinance, and every property in San Diego County is affected by that. Whether you're going to sell the house or not, theoretically, you're supposed to comply to the vegetation management ordinance. Whether you're selling or not, CAL FIRE could come by and say, hey, we noticed you got a lot of dead trees on this property. You got branches overhanging your house. You need to remove that. So that doesn't have nothing to do with selling the house. So that's the box you want to check. Then paragraph B is seller's representation of whether they're in compliance or not. So the boilerplate is, and this is an awareness question. By the way, question A is a fact-based question. If you don't know, you'd have to find out. And again, luckily, all of you work for a company that the broker pays somebody to pay attention to this. And I can tell you, it's got to be checked is. So now you can help your client and just tell them check is. Okay. But whether they're in compliance or not, I don't know. You don't know, and they probably don't know. Now, the risk you're going to take is sometimes sellers think they are in a compliance. They believe they are because they don't know that they're not. So that's not going to work if they don't have an actual inspection report. So the only reason you would check B2 and say, yes, I'm in compliance is, okay, you got a report. By the way, the report I think has to be dated within, I think, yeah, 6 months. It has to be dated within 6 months. And it's clear. It says, yep, you're in complete compliance. If you don't have a report within 6 months, go back to the boilerplate. The boilerplate is you're not sure, and that's the safest approach. But if you do have a report and it says you're in compliance, of course, give it. Even more importantly, if you have a report, again, you have a report that says you're not in compliance, that would be pretty critical. You should probably state that. And you would state that based upon the report that you're holding. And you give that report to the buyer. All right. So that's a little confusing, but hopefully not too. All right. Now, paragraph C is the one that everybody has struggles with. So I don't want to spend a lot of time going through each option, but there are two options that I think are going to cover you 99% of the time. So the one option, if you're selling the property, we recommend that the seller transfer the responsibility of getting an inspection and bringing the property into compliance if necessary, that be shifted to the buyer, and they do that after close of escrow. Civil code allows that. Here's what I say to people who, even when I explain to them the law and, it's about a 5 to 10 minute little conversation. I've done it so many times. Most of the time people get it. They usually go, oh, okay, now I get it. Thanks a lot. Appreciate that. Every once in a while I get the feeling, and they maybe don't say it outright, but they kind of suggest it. Okay, Walt, you sound like a smart guy, but you're not CAL FIRE. No offense. You're a general manager of a local real estate company. CAL FIRE, they should know. And we called CAL FIRE. City of Escondido, they should know. And we called the city. San Diego, on their website, they should know. It says that the seller has to bring the property into compliance. So what I say to them when I get that feeling, and I suggest to them, would I be wrong if I said, would I be wrong if I said that in all probability, Car Legal is not going to draft a form that enables you to violate the law? Now, most people understand what I just said, but some people say, what do you mean? Okay, is there a form in car forms that is a waiver of a TDS? Well, no, of course not. That's not legal. Exactly. If you have to give a TDS, if your property qualifies for a TDS, you don't need you have to give it. If it doesn't qualify for a TDS, if it's exempt, you don't need a waiver. But if you're supposed to give a TDS, there's no option to waive it, right? Yeah, of course, right. So the car doesn't make any form to allow you to waive it, because they're not going to create a form that allows you to violate the law. They begin to get it. Would Car Legal have C3, 3C3, which is what this paragraph is, on their form if it was illegal? If the seller can't, because the conversation starts with the other side sometimes. No, you have to do an inspection. You can't give it to the buyer. Car Legal or City of San Diego, City of Escondido. I talked to them. They said, well, look at the form. Yeah. So anyway, the issue is point of sale. That's the issue. It's not required as a point of sale. So check C3, C3, 3C3 if you're the seller. That's probably the best way to go. Now, if you're the buyer, you might not want to go with 3C3. Let me share that with you in a second. Okay, so here's a summary of what you need to know right there. If you printed out these last few pages out of the hand, it's in your handout. It tells you, check is, go with the boilerplate unless you are aware and have a report. Then you can go with 2 or 3. And then finally go with 3C3, buyer responsibility. Now, here's what you need to consider if you represent the buyer. you're buying a property in the middle of the suburbs of Mira Mesa, assuming the responsibility for getting an inspection and bringing the property in compliance is probably not a big deal. But if you have 10 acres out in Ramona, you might not want to assume that responsibility without knowing exactly what it involves. So then you might consider, not recommending you do it, but I'm recommending you consider it, insisting that the seller do an inspection and bring the property into compliance. Now, that could be a deal breaker, by the way, if the seller doesn't want to do it, because the law says the buyer and the seller have to come to an agreement, basically in 3C3. Buyer and the seller have to agree to one of these 6 paragraphs. So that is, if you're a listing agent, why I recommend you should counter the FHDS properly filled out and checking 3C3 with your counter. 9 times out of 10, the buyer, well, what's this? Oh, okay, yeah, whatever, good. And sign it. And then later when there's, no, you got to get an inspection. No, you've already agreed, I don't. Hope that helps. Okay, here's the simplest one. And the only reason I bring it up is in the last month or two, I've had 2 or 3 agents struggle with this. And over the years, I get questions like this all the time. What about holes in the walls? And the problem is it's such a simple thing and it blows up. Recently, one agent wrote, I think, $1,000 check to keep his buyer happy because the seller repaired the holes in the wall incorrectly. And the seller refused to do anything, and the agent said, my buyer's matter and heck, and so I'm going to just write the check. So something so simple, I want you to be aware of what your options are and what your requirements are. Okay, so a seller is not obligated to repair holes in walls after removing what I'm going to call wall hangings, which are pictures, mirrors, and other things you hang up on the wall. You put a nail in the hole in the wall, you put a little hook in the wall. You are not obligated to repair those holes. And that was the most recent problem. They patched up little tiny nail holes, and they used the paint that wasn't an exact match, and the buyer went ballistic. Well, the seller shouldn't have even done that. And that includes brackets, nails, and other fastening devices, with one exception, and I'll tell you that in a minute. Unless otherwise agreed. Now, if the offer says seller shall patch all nail holes, then you could, that's contractual. There's no law either way. It's the contract. The boilerplate of the contract is this first statement. Don't need to do it. But if somebody writes in the offer, yeah, you do, well, then you do. So here's my suggestion. Don't ask and don't agree. As a buyer's agent, I would not recommend, if you're going to spend money to make the buyer happy anyway, tell the buyer, I'll give you a few bucks. I'll go over there with a brush and touch it up for you. And if you're the seller, oh yeah, I got paint. Yeah, the paint you got it's all crusted and dried up now. So you got to go to Home Depot, and now you get a paint that's a close match because you didn't take an exact wall chip. And then it's clearly, you got all these spots that are clearly fresh spots. And that's the problem this agent just had. Now the wall needs to be repainted. So stay away from that if you can. All right. And this is detailed, by the way, in the RPA paragraph 7B. You have a copy of that in your handout. Okay, now there is an exception for certain brackets, and that is brackets that mount audio and video components that do not convey. It also covers brackets that secure furniture. I don't know how many of you do it. With everything you buy today, you get, furniture, bookcase or something like that. You get a little strap that you screw to the top of the bookcase and then bolt to the wall, and that creates a bit of a hole. That does have to be patched. So in these instances, the brackets shall be removed and the holes or other damages should be repaired, and but not repainted. So you patch up the hole, that's easy to do, quite frankly. And again, stay away from repainting if you can, because that's where not had too many problems with the patches when done badly. I have had lots of problems with a mismatch in the paint. And I'm always thinking when I hear these stories, my gosh, it wasn't even required. The contract exempted the seller from doing that. But now the seller's damaged the property. They've got all these spots on the wall that don't match the rest of the wall. So now again, unless otherwise agreed, and again, don't do that. All right, so that's repairing holes. That's documented in paragraph 9C. If you want to look that up. Okay, this is important, and if I run out of time, I'm glad I'm not going to skip this because this can be serious. And that is if you sell your own or a relative's property. This information is contained in Agent Hub. It's under, I think it's contracts and documents or contracts or forms. And that's where all of the REMAX connection forms that I've created over the years that are still valid. That's where you find those. That's where you find the addendum to the agency disclosure. You find other things there too. There's a tab that says selling your own or a relative's property, and all of these forms I'm going to talk about in that property. So first of all, there's instructions. What do you need to do? And this is pretty important because our area of emissions assurance has very specific requirements. I think I've said this before. Typically, errors in emission insurance do not insure, number one, flips. Number two, agents selling their own or a relative's property if they are in fact the agent. Well, I've fought that. Of course, I'm not going to fight the E&O. I'm going to solve the problem though, because even today, and as long as I've been in real estate with Remax United, when both Fred and Cheyenne owned it, we had a lot of agents that are investors. Some are flippers. And if I tell them they're going to have to hire somebody to sell the properties that they're flipping or investing in and then reselling, some of you are going to take a hike. I'm a nice guy. Fred's a nice guy. Cheyenne was a nice lady. We might not have been that nice, you know. So early on, and the same with Mike. I mean, Mike's a great guy, but if we suddenly say you cannot sell your own property, you have to hire another agent to do it. Some of you are going to have a problem with that. Uh, so I've always lobbied the error and omissions insurance people before we place a policy with them to allow us to do transactions, even though we're related to the entity. So and the description of relatives is pretty broad, as you can see. So I've lobbied them that we should be able to do our own transactions if we do certain things. So we have certain rules that apply when the agent sells their own property or a property they have interest in, or if anybody affiliated with the agent, any entity or any human being, I'm selling my brother-in-law's house. Yeah, this covers it. I'm selling my divorced wife's daughter's house. This applies. Like I said, the relative or affiliated definition that was on the screen prior to this is pretty broad. Okay, I got ahead of where am I at? Lost myself. Okay, let me go back. I think I skipped something. All right, let's do it. So errors of emission insurance, if you apply if you follow our risk reduction guidelines, you attend this class, you complete your files, you do everything you're supposed to do, the deductible is 10,000 and we will cover the second 5. If you're selling your own property, we do have the potential for a deductible at 20,000. I've been able to get that reduced to the 10 on a couple of occasions. And so the deductible is a little higher. But again, we will cover half if you follow all of the rules. You don't, then it won't be covered. So here's the conditions for your transactions to even be covered at all. All right. So a written home inspection report issued by ASHI, KRIA, NASHI, or NAHI member inspector. So in other words, a certified inspector with one of these entities. They're a member of one of these entities. If they're a member, that counts as being a certified inspector with those organizations. All right. So it can't be an inspection report by my dad, even though your dad's a contractor. You know, you have to have a written inspection report. It can't, by the way, be the report that the previous buyer used, then that buyer left, canceled. And now this report's fine. I'll just use it. No, it's got to be one that the current buyer hires. Now, the seller can pay for it. That can be a credit through escrow, but the inspector has to work for the buyer. An approved home warranty is in place. That all the car documents that are required on this list are in the file. Okay, so agent AD, I'm not too worried about that. You guys do that. Affiliated disclosure, I'm not worried about that. TDS, we do that. Now, here's the point I want to make. Sometimes somebody closes the deal and they forgot the affiliated business disclosure. Well, we're not going to cook you in oil. We're not going to not pay you. We're going to be aware of the fact that you didn't get it. We're going to talk to you, and we're going to forgive you. I mean, everybody makes mistakes. I make mistakes. So just be careful. In a typical transaction, you're going to get what I call a get out of jail free card. Lindsay's real friendly. She's going to tell you what you're missing, but she's not going to come over and beat you up if you don't put it in the file. The problem is if you forgot or didn't do an affiliated business disclosure statement, you can't add it after the close of escrow. And if it is a claim filed and they're aware of it, now I won't report it to them. I'm going to try to get them to cover the claim to the greatest extent I can. But that would be a way for them to get out of it if they wanted to. So these forms, although of course you do all these forms, you've got to be sure when you're doing your own transactions that you're extra careful. All right. AVID, an SPQ, again, if it's required. Fire hardening and dispensable space advisory, if it's required. A lead-based paint, if it's required. Earthquake safety hazard report, if built prior to 1960. A statewide seller advisory, the SBSA. So basically our typical file, QS or a FERPTA. And additionally, the natural hazard disclosure report and natural hazard disclosure statement signed by the with a signature page signed by the buyer. Okay, these are things you do all the time. Now here's where it gets a little more detailed, and that is be sure that you provide a list of all the repairs you made to the property. That's pretty important. And again, most of the time people are doing that and acknowledged by the buyer. Now, the property is 1 to 4 residential units. Now, here's the biggie. The file includes a RE/MAX connection supplement to the real estate purchase agreement. That is critical to be in the file. That missing could cause them to not want to cover the transaction. It's not a car form. It's an agent hub. So they do allow dual agency, so you could even sell a house yourself. But you would want another agent to be, help you work with the buyer. So if that comes up, let me know. We can work on that. Again, the property involved is 1 to 4 residential units, and the file contains a RE/MAX supplement. I don't know why. So what is the supplement? This is the supplement. And it's a 3-page document. It got so much stuff on it that we couldn't even put the letterhead on it. We didn't want to make it 4 pages. 3 is long enough. And this form is dictated by the E&O. Now, I rewrote the form years ago because the form they gave me was unusable. I mean, you couldn't do it in a transaction. It made no sense. It would have been a nightmare. So I tried to make this buyer and agent friendly. But what these things contain are required. So, for example, they want to document that the buyer's agent reviewed with the buyer all of these various inspections. And that's why that's on that form. So we'll go through it real quickly. It's typical. Identify who the parties are. Physical inspection, a roof inspection, mold. Now, these aren't getting inspections. They're not even indicating they want the inspections. What they're saying is, when they initial this, that they're aware that they could get one if they wanted. You know, that these inspections are out there in the world, and if a buyer was concerned about mold, you could get a mold inspection. You could get an environmental inspection, pool inspection, get geological inspection if you're worried about unstable ground, you're on a hill or something. These inspections exist because here's what this form is designed to do. It's designed to protect the agent and, of course, the E&O from the buyer saying, well, nobody told me about a geological inspection. I didn't know I could have that retaining wall that's falling over. I could have the ground under it inspected. I knew the wall was no good, but it wasn't the wall that's the problem now that I own the house. It's that the ground is shifting. This whole lot sliding down the hill. And suddenly it's a couple of $100,000 claim. And their first offense is going to be, well, no agent advised me to get a geological inspection. So this is why these are there, so that the agent, the buyer's agent and the buyer are acknowledging they saw this, they're aware of it. See, it circumvents their ability to make that claim. Permits and zoning, they can research that if they want. Square footage, they can research that. Pet urine stains and odors, if they're concerned about that at all. There's things you can check on for that. Now, there's an acknowledgement that the buyer's agent and the buyer initial that says that we're not responsible for verifying the information provided by others as seller. There's advice against waiving an inspection. See, so again, that's the buyer's initials on that. And then they agree what we can't do. We can't, inspect the property. We can't do all the things we know we can't do. We can't identify where the boundary line is. We can't give them legal advice or tax advice. So we can only advise them on information that we are supposed to know in order to be licensed. And then here's where it sometimes gets a little confusing. They want the buyer to, they being the E&O company, wants the buyer to make a indication if they're interested in any of these inspections. The buyer's elected to get any of these inspections. And if the buyer doesn't know, I don't know yet, well, just say you might, just initially, roof inspection. Pool doesn't apply, there is no pool. Now, I'm not going to worry about permits and zoning. Okay, don't initial that. But I might want to get a mold. Well, then say, initial that. Just initial any inspections you might get and waive the ones you don't get. Okay. And of course, there's a signature. Now, the next form you may not need, but if the buyer on the supplement elects to get a bunch of inspections and then it's getting ready to close and they haven't gotten those inspections, then you need a waiver of those inspections. It works just like a buyer's election of inspections, the car form. If they elect to get certain inspections, then they find out, oh, no, it's going to cost you $300. Well, I don't want to pay $300. Well, you indicated you wanted the inspection. Now you're saying you don't because it's too expensive. We got to protect ourselves. You got to protect you because they're going to claim that they wanted that inspection. You knew it. They asked for it, and you let it close without it. No, you told me you weren't going to get it. Well, then get that in writing. So this form is pretty straightforward, identifies who the people are. It's got advice against waiving any inspections. And then these should be check boxes. I didn't realize that. But the buyers originally elected to obtain these inspections, and then there should be boxes. I'll edit that somehow in the various generations of this form, those boxes turned into dots. But you can just check the one, circle or check the one they want. They want a roof inspection, that's all. So that's the only one you do. Now they decide not to get the roof inspection. Well, then they're going to waive it. So down here, then they would waive the roof inspection. Okay. See, so that's how this is an amendment to the supplement if they are not getting some of those inspections they check. Interestingly enough, experience tells me that most of the time they don't initial anything on the supplement anyway. But if they do and they don't get that inspection, you want to, have that resolved. Now, this is critical. This is language for seller counteroffers or seller multiple counteroffers, because the buyer's not going to, put this in the counter. What I've just reviewed with you is not the law. It's our E&O requirement so that you can sell your own property without having to hire another agent to do it, and so that you can flip your own flips without having to hire another agent in our company, because the agent's not going to do it for free, because they have to work on it. We used to have straw agents, and we got caught. And that's why I'm so adamant about this. We got caught because we were naming an agent as a listing agent, and the agent was in name only, and the agent wasn't being paid anything. And there was an agreement between the two agents in our company. Look, I'll just put you down as my agent, but you don't need to worry about anything. I'll go to the inspections. I'll negotiate the repairs. I'll handle everything. Okay, yeah, put me down, no problem. Well, we got busted for that. We actually got sued, and during the lawsuit, they discovered that, in fact, the agent named as the agent hadn't done anything on the transaction. It was not an easy thing to talk them, them being the E&O company, to ensure that transaction, because there was a significant claim that the buyer successfully prevailed on. So, kind of the deal was, all right, we're gonna forgive you this time, but never again. So we had to eliminate that straw agent concept. So any of you think, well, I'll just name another agent to be the agent. Well, you got to give that agent all of the work. And if he's going to do it for free and put his name on the transaction and spend all his time and doesn't want any money, more power to you. But they probably don't want to do that. So you want to do it yourself. You're allowed to. But we need that form, that supplement. We need an inspection. There's no law that you have to get a physical inspection. That we have to have a home warranty in place. There's no law that says that. So you've got to put it in the contract. So cut and paste these exact words. This language needs to be written word for word. So you can either, I think Lindsay has created this in a cut and pasteable form, and it's pretty easy to retype it, I guess, for most people. But you want this paragraph 1, and I would make it paragraph 1. If you're selling your own or a relative's property, and everything's good, and all you need to do is just counter that, then you got to counter that, because this happens all the time. And right now, right as I speak, we have a transaction. The agent did not get the supplement, and now he's trying to get the supplement more than once. Broker on the other side says, we don't sign other broker forms. No, we're not doing that. We're not giving that to our buyer. They've said that even when it was in the counter, and because it's in the counter, they ended up doing it. But in this particular case, it wasn't. There was no counter like this. And so right now, we're trying to sweet talk them into it. But right now, they're refusing to do that supplement. And that, if there's ever a claim, that's going to be a weakness that we might be exposed to. We're not going to tell oh, by the way, we didn't do the supplement. But if they discover it's not in there, they might halfway through the claim say, oh, the supplement, oh, I'm sorry, we're not going to cover this. See, that's what I want you to avoid. So again, that language needs to be word for word. So ideally cut and paste it. It has the 3 things that are not law and is easy not to do. So we got to get them contractually obligated. They're going to hire an inspector who's a member of one of those organizations. Again, you can credit the seller. I'm sorry, you can credit the buyer through escrow as a closing cost credit. So the buyer pays for the inspection, you give the seller a credit. In those cases, we have one agent who has to do these inspections on new construction. I actually went to bat for him to try to get that to not be required for new construction, and the E&O said, no, got to do it for new construction as well. So the buyer had to hire him, and then the agent credits part of the buyer's closing costs to cover the inspection, cost of the inspector. The home warranty has to be in place. And then finally, they have to do the supplement. Okay, I'm going to try to get through this next 2 parts real quickly. Any questions on selling your own or relative's property, by all means, give me a call. Okay, so the RLA and unrepresented buyers. People still struggle with this. I'm going to zoom through this. Unrepresented buyers, as a result of requirements that agents must have buyer representation agreements to represent a buyer. Now, a buyer can buy a house. Buyer's not required by law to sign a buyer representation agreement. But an agent is required by law, and our agents are required to get it even quicker. So every agent who writes an offer in California, every agent has to first have a buyer representation agreement. And that buyer representation agreement, by law, must specify compensation. And ultimately the buyer could be responsible for that compensation. You can ask the seller to pay it for the buyer. But it's against the law to write something that says, agent will only be buyer will only be obligated to pay agent, or will not be obligated to pay agent if seller won't pay him. That is not allowed. So ultimately, but you can pass it on to somebody. We're all pretty familiar with that. So listing agents need to discuss this with sellers, because you're going to have unrepresented buyers come forward from time to time. They're not going to want to sign and be obligated to pay a commission to a buyer. They're not going to want to take a risk that the seller won't pay it for them. So when you take a listing, discuss this with the seller, that an agent needs to get a BRBC or a PSRA signed, before they can write an offer. And it specifies compensation that the buyer is ultimately responsible. It can be paid by others, but if it's not, the buyer would have to pay. And of course, some buyers are not going to want to do that, so they're going to elect to avoid it and just go unrepresented and show up at your house and they don't have an agent. So they're going to make offers, right, without having an agent. So now when you're dealing with an unrepresented buyer, there's a high likelihood the transaction won't close. No one's walking them through the process, the financial appraisal process, disclosure and inspection process, the repairs and final walkthrough process. As we all know on this call, those are fairly complicated. That's why they pay you the big bucks. It's not easy to do all this. And now the buyer's going to do it on his own, because he's not going to be willing to pay an agent. So when dealing with unrepresented buyers, you're exposed to more liability because no one's advising the buyer. The buyer is going to blame the listing agent. So you, as the listing agent, if an unrepresented buyer buys a property, you're going to have a little more liability, just a matter of fact. All right, buyer closes and then later gets a lawyer to sue some issue that he feels wasn't adequately addressed. But whose fault was that? You didn't have an agent. I'm not responsible to advise you. But it's going to cause you problems. So I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. And by the way, I'm going through this fast. If you like some of that, I'll put a PDF in the agent hub. I think Lindsay does that from time to time. I don't do it with every presentation, but I'll do it with this one because it's pretty straightforward. So you got to decide what you're going to do before you encounter an unrepresented buyer. You want to make a couple of decisions. First is, you even want to accept an offer. I confirmed with Car Legal twice. A seller can, C-A-N, yes, can require a buyer to be represented by their house. Now, that's easy to say up front, but the seller's been on the market for 4 months. Nobody comes forward. Here comes a guy ready to buy it, ready to pay his price, but will not seek representation. Seller's going to change their mind in that particular situation. But to start with, the seller might want to say, no, you can instruct all buyers, get that in writing from the seller, instruct all buyers that seller will only consider offers from buyers who have representation. All right, or they can say we don't require buyers to obtain representation. Or if they elect to deal with unrepresented buyer, how much additional cost will be involved? That's why I went through some of that at the beginning of this, because you need to present this to your seller, because you're going to want additional compensation if you're going to be working on a transaction. You're the listing agent and the buyer's unrepresented. You're going to do twice as much work, take twice as much of your time. Your liability is going to go up. Someone's going to have to hold this buyer's hand through the entire process, writing and rewriting offers, counter offers, addendums, be available for inspections and revisits by relatives. I mean, you're going to be doing the work of the buyer's agent, but you're not getting compensated for it. Providing documentation to their lender, the kinds of things buyer's agents do, follow up with them throughout the entire escrow. You got to have this conversation with the sellers at the listing presentation. Unrepresented buyers can be very problematic, take a lot of your time, higher likelihood of not closing, so you're spinning your wheels, greater liability. So when approached by an unrepresented buyer, advise the buyer they should seek representation, offer representation. It can be a dual agency. It can be, another RE/MAX agent working with them. You're still a dual agent. You're still a dual agent, but I'll work with the seller, and the person I'm going to refer you to will work with you. Use the phrase work with. Now, if the buyer wants to proceed without representation, follow the procedure agreed to with the seller. Now, if the seller says, seller will not entertain offers, then you can pass that on to the buyer. Or if the seller wants to, no, I'll accept their offer, then you got to facilitate that. As the seller's agent, you're obligated to do that. So the RLA gives you the opportunity to be compensated for unrepresented buyer extra work you got to do. So it's in paragraph 4B is your regular compensation. Paragraph 2C2 is additional compensation if the buyer is not represented. This is not dual agency. This is a buyer being unrepresented, and now you got to do the extra work. So you can document that by checking that box and collecting an additional. This is additional to what's in C1. C2 is additional. So you got 2.5% there, and you want 2% here because you want to, if you're going to be working with the buyer, you want 4.5%. But you're not being paid that to represent the buyer. The representation amount you would get if you represented the buyer would be on a BRBC, and this would not apply. That's the point I want to make sure to make. This is, and that's why I want to spend some time on why you want to present it this way, because this is the seller's cost, not the buyer's agent's cost, because you're not representing the buyer. You have no BRBC. So the seller is going to end up paying additional compensation. Hope that's kind of clear. It does not apply to dual agency. If that confuses you, give me a call. Providing forms to unrepresented buyers, use the BNA. The BNA, I'll show you a picture, it's in your handout. And then every time you deal with the buyer, make these statements. I do not represent you. I'm providing forms, or I'm doing whatever I'm doing at the request of the seller to facilitate the sale. I recommend you obtain a representation. Repeat this statement with every contact you make with the buyer. Put it in multiple emails. That's how you're going to avoid the claim that, no, you really were my agent because you acted like my agent. You never explained to me you weren't your agent. What do you mean? I have 19 emails during the whole transaction, and everyone said, I don't represent you. I'm doing this as a representative of the seller at the request of the seller, and I recommend you get representation. You got that in even 3 emails. You're going to go a long way to not being susceptible to an represented buyer without adequate documentation that you are the buyer's agent. And so that's the BNA right there. Use the BNA. Can a buyer submit? If the buyer submits a non-car form offer, please do not try to work with it. Please counter that the buyer submit a car form. You can give the car form, the blank car form, put the property address and your name as the listing agent on it. Don't give a blank form. Give a form with the property address and your name on it as the listing agent. Now, if the buyer submits a non-car form offer, you could also counter that, okay, you got to, with the RPA filled out the way the seller will accept it. So your counter could be the RPA, and all the blanks are filled in on what the seller will accept. That's another way to handle that. Now, the last thing I want to tell you is don't forget, if this listing expires and you worked you worked with a couple of non-represented buyers and then they fell out of escrow, they might come back. And if they come back, even if they're represented, you're still entitled to compensation if they saw the house during your listing period, but you have to identify them. So don't forget C3 or 2C3. Don't forget it anytime, but don't forget to take advantage of that when you're listing the people that were in the house, and you want to protect yourself with those people, the continuation of the right to be paid. Don't forget the unrepresented buyer that you helped a month ago who went away, because he might be back. All right. So, and then finally, real quickly, modifying the BRBC with regard to broker compensation. This should be real quick. So you're all familiar with the BRBC, and compensation is in paragraph 2E, and there's the amount of compensation in E1. You fill that in, of course. And if you're going to be paid, so-called transaction fee, just additional dollars. Don't identify it. That can cause you problems. So, pay me 2.5% plus $500. That's what you would do there. Okay. Now, here's what I recommend. You cannot go up. You can always come down. It is actually probably actionable, which means you can be sued if you raise your compensation pursuant to a specific property. Now, could you say, I'm going to work with you for 2%, and after 2 weeks, this guy is such a pain in the neck, you don't want to work with him anymore for 2%. If I'm going to work with you, I want 5%. Well, I want 3%. I'll pay you 3. You can go up in that case. It's a completely different circumstance. But if you are already involved in a property, you cannot go up, because you somehow figured out the seller would have paid you 3%. But I only have a BRBC for 2% or 2.5%. You can't do that. But you can go down. That's my point. So if I were doing real estate today, I'm not, I know it'd be a challenge, but I would want to get at least 2.5 or 3% on every single BRBC I wrote, and explain, look, I don't want you to lose a house because the seller will only cover 2% of that. I'll consider that, and hopefully you got a good enough relationship with the buyer that they would accept that. So if you start small, and the reason I'm stressing this so much is I've already had several agents. We had one, was a day away from closing escrow. And we became aware of the fact that the seller had agreed to pay the agent more than what the BRBC was. And we did the escrow. That's very problematic, because that is against the law. I told the agent, I wish to God I didn't know it, because we'd still be in trouble, but I would have then said, gee, I didn't know. But now I know I got to tell you, you can't get paid that much. So don't start low and think you can come up. You cannot. Start high and come down a little bit. All right. So if you're going to come down, okay, so you let's say you're really good and you convince the buyer to sign something for 3%, but they're pretty adamant, I want the seller to pay that. Well, we'll ask, and if they won't pay all of it, within reason, I'll work with you. Okay, great. 3%. Seller says, are you nuts? I'm not paying 3%. I'll give you 2%. All right, you'll come down to 2%. Now you can come down. And so then you'd use the modification of terms to come down. And you'd use the compensation paragraph, and you would change the amount of compensation. It's changed, and you do a from 3% to 2%. Now check this box. This is very important. This modification is only going to apply to this property, and list the property. And I used to tell you to write that, but then, and that's the old form. I had that in my notes, and oh no, they've changed that form. I was, I'm not sure I'm one of the people that the reason they changed it, but I notified, I talked to one of the attorneys who's very big on the forms committee, and I said that, if they're going to write that on every single MT, why don't we just put it in a boilerplate? Doesn't that make more sense? Bingo. I think I'm not the only one that said that. So you modify your commission downward, and you say only for this one, because the next seller might pay you 3% if this one falls out. Okay, that's it, folks. I don't think we went too far over. I'm amazed we got through it that quickly. Lindsay, do we have any questions?
Yeah, Emily Zach wants to know, do we have to use the FHDS when we are listing a condo, or will the condo cert cover this?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Do we have to use the FHDS when we're listing a condo, or will the
Yes.
condo cert cover it?
The condo cert has more to do with owner occupancy and other financial issues. They may have
Okay.
stuff in that, sir. This code and that agreement in paragraph 3, the whole form is in the civil code, and paragraph 3 is what is specifically in AB 38. The AB 38, a lot of that's a law that people quote because it starts out saying in order for a seller to sell their house, they have to get a fire inspection and bring the property into compliance. That's why the code. That's I thought a law was going to be written, by the way. But then Carr got involved and said, "Are you kidding me? You know how many transactions you would blow up today?" And at the time, they didn't have a lot of inspectors. Some study was done right away, and they realized that would impact 900. Oh no, yeah, nine. No, that would impact transactions for 9 months. They would delay closings for 9 months. And so then they rewrote the law. Okay, you have to get an inspection if uh, there's a local ordinance that says it. Because a couple of localities, Truckee and Paradise, they burned to the ground. I suspect there'll be some communities in LA that might say the same thing going forward. So then they just said, if there's a local ordinance requiring it, then you have to do it. Again, only if there's a local ordinance. There isn't one in San Diego. Now, the point of this is it also says if you're not getting the inspection prior to close of escrow, buyer and seller must agree on how you're going to handle that. And that's what paragraph 3C is all about. That's actually in the code. There must be an agreement. And if you don't do an FHDS and you don't come to an agreement with 3C, you're in violation of the code.
Concerning the FHDS, if 3C3 is checked, have you ever seen the buyer having to do an inspection after owning for under 1 year?
I've not heard of one. I've not heard of one. I've talked to some people who closed their transaction 2 and 3 years ago, and they haven't heard from anybody.
Does Remax Connections charge a fee from commission when selling a relative's property?
Say that again.
Does Remax Connections charge a fee from your commission when selling a relative's property? Yes.
Do we charge a fee?
Yes, we charge a split.
Yeah,
whatever's on your ICA, we charge.
Absolutely. Yeah. You get a much more reduced split. We charge a transaction fee because we got to pay money every time you do a transaction. It costs us money, and so that's what the transaction fee is about. The split is, our overhead and hopefully a little bit of profit. Mike's not made much profit. Most brokers don't on the transactional side of real estate. They make a little bit on the escrow side. That's why we always encourage you to do it. My goal, just so you know, if I ever call you up, I'm trying to at least break even on the transaction side. Okay. So we'll continue not to make any money on the transaction side, but we don't want to pay money out of our pocket because you're selling your own house. So that's the evolution of why there's a transaction fee. And so we reduce the fees you pay us as far as splits when you sell your own personal residence, and we do that once a year.
Can you add sewer inspection to the Remax amendment to the supplement of the real estate purchase agreement?
Say that again.
Can you add sewer inspection to the Remax amendment to the supplement to the purchase agreement?
Well, you don't need to do that, but you can, when you say, can the buyer get a sewer inspection? He can get any.
Well, can we add it to the list of inspections that they can choose?
Well, no, just so everyone's clear, Carr has an excellent form that has about 30 inspections on it. The supplement is dictated by the E&O company. I didn't make up the supplement. I did rewrite it because the way it worked I sold real estate. There's no way you're going to get, it was so convoluted. It was just terrible. And in fact, just to pat myself on the back, the original was no small company, Cress. We've been with Cress multiple times. Cress is one of the bigger E&O operations in the country. Cress actually stole that form from me after I rewrote it because I got permission from them to use that instead of their dictated form. And it was sort of sweet. I did that through our attorney at the time. They said, yeah, you can use that. Can we use it? Yeah, I guess you can. I didn't copyright it. Go ahead. Yeah, so back to your question. So I'm not going to add it to the supplement to make the even up a problem. If your buyer wants a sewer inspection, they can indicate that to you on an MT. They can indicate that to you on a buyer election of inspections or inspections elections. I think it's election of inspections. And of course, like I said, if there's anything on an not an MT, I'm sorry, a BMI. You can add it to a BMI. You can add it to a buyer's election of inspections. And if there's anything on there that they don't ultimately do, you've got to get them to waive it. I hope that answered more than adequately answered the question.
You want to stop your screen share, Walt?
Yeah, how do I do that? That's what I'm struggling with that.
Just go to where there's like a tab at either the top or the bottom of your screen. It should say stop share. You hover over the top or bottom. Okay, there you go.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you.
If
That's
I'm
why I had
the
to repeat questions. Like I thought a little button here to click, and I'm looking for it. I'm not hearing your question. Then I say, okay, I better pay attention.
if I am the listing agent on another agent's property, not a relative, do I need to add that verbiage to seller counteroffer for the supplement?
You're the listing agent on another agent's property. Well, first of all, is the other. Let me think about that a little bit, but I'll give you a quick answer. Not for sure if the other side's represented. If the other side has an agent, then I can tell you absolutely don't need to add it. I don't think you do anyway. You do have to disclose in the MLS if you are related or you're the owner of the property in the MLS. You do have to disclose to an unrepresented buyer that you have an interest in the property or are related to someone who has an interest in the property. But selling another agent's, no.
Have you seen any unrepresented buyers?
Have we seen any unrepresented buyers? Well, Lindsay would better answer that than I would. I don't
Not
think
very
so.
many. There's
No,
not
too
that
many.
many at all.
Right. I can't.
I've probably seen one or two since the BRBC came out.
Yeah.
If the buyer originally presented as not being represented, then finds out the seller is paying compensation on behalf of the buyer, the buyer agrees to have you represent them knowing it's in their best interest and the seller is amicable with a dual agency. Is that compliant and okay? Do you want me to repeat that?
Yeah, repeat that, but I think I followed it.
If the buyer originally presented as not being represented, then finds out the seller is paying compensation on behalf of the buyer agrees to have you represent them knowing it's in their best interest and the seller is amicable with the dual agency, is that compliant and okay?
That's an interesting question, actually. The short answer is going to be yes. And it's going to be the agent-friendly answer because I could get into a little bit of the weeds, but I think I could get around it. You're not allowed to charge, the compensation you charge can't be whatever the seller will pay. That can't be on any documentation. And this sounds kind of verbally like it, but it doesn't. A buyer has every right to say, oh my gosh, if the seller would compensate me, I would hire an agent, and you're going to charge what you charge. You're not going to say, well, let me figure out what the seller will pay, and then I'm going to charge you. See, that's what you wouldn't want to document doing that. But if you happen to know the seller would pay 2% or 2.5%, and you're willing to work for 2.5%, you should not be penalized because you know that. So yeah, no, that would be fine. And I would say that what drives it is the buyer realizing he could get representation and not have to pay any money. which is legal. So whoever answers that question, go get them. It's okay.
That's all the questions, unless anyone has one they want to ask, but
Any
that's all
hands
that's in the
raised?
chat.
I don't see any hands raised. I
Nope.
think we're in good shape. All right. Well, I'm going to end this by thanking all of you that are here today. I've got a couple of super duper classes coming up in my mind. I hope you'll find them super duper. But like I said, the next class is probably going to be the clear cooperation, including some sales guidance. And that'll be coming up real soon. And I'll close with Go Celtics. They're 2-0. And if they win the next two, they take the next step.
Thank you, Walt.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Walt.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye,
Walt. Good
everybody.
class.
Take care.
Thanks,
Thank
Walt.
you.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you.